The winter of 862 years after Christ arrives early in the fjords of Hordaland, on Norway's western coast. Ice locks the harbours by the feast of St. Martin in November, and snow falls without cease through the darkest months. The sun barely crests the horizon before sliding back below, leaving the world in perpetual twilight. In the longhouse of Bergr the Shipwright, young Astrid Bergsdottir watches her family's stores dwindle week by week. The salted fish turns to slime in its barrels. Astrid lifts the wooden lid and recoils at the smell, not the clean brine scent that should be there, but something foul and wrong. The flesh that should be firm and preserved has become soft, almost liquid, a disgusting mass that no amount of hunger could make edible. Her father stares at the ruined barrel, 3 months of fishing work rendered worthless. They dump it outside for the dogs, but even the dogs turn away. The dried meat hanging from the rafters fares little better. Despite the cold, despite the smoke that should preserve it, the strips grow soft with rot. Green mould creeps across surfaces that should stay dry and hard. When Astrid touches the meat, her fingers come away damp with something that feels like decay. They cut away the mouldy portions, but each week brings more loss, more waste, more fear. Her younger brother Halvard grows thin, his eyes too large in his shrunken face. He is 10 years old, at the age when boys should be growing strong and tall, preparing to join the ship crews. Instead, he grows weaker each day. His ribs show through his skin, his arms lose their muscle. He stops running and playing, sitting instead by the fire with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. Her sister Ragnhild, just 8 years old, coughs through the nights. The sound echoes through the longhouse, a wet, painful cough that wakes everyone. Their mother, Jorunn, makes her drink hot water with herbs, but the herbs do little when the body has no strength to fight. Ragnhild's face takes on a grey cast, her lips pale, her hands cold even close to the fire. Astrid, at 17, feels the hunger in her own belly, but she is old enough to understand what she sees. This is not just a hard winter. This is death approaching, slow and patient. Every household in the settlement faces the same struggle. The storage methods that have served the Norse people for generations are failing. Something about this winter, whether the unusual cold, the early ice, or some other factor, has defeated their traditional preservation techniques. Jorunn tends her children with herbs and prayers to Frigg, the goddess of the household. She burns offerings at the small shrine in the corner of the longhouse, where carved wooden figures of the old gods still stand despite the Christian priest's disapproval. She sings the old songs, the prayers passed down from her mother and grandmother, asking the gods to spare her children, to make the winter pass quickly, to protect what little food remains. But Jorunn herself weakens. The lung fever takes her in the coldest part of winter, when the wind howls around the longhouse and snow drifts against the walls. She lies on her sleeping bench, wrapped in furs, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Astrid sits beside her through the long nights, holding her mother's hand, feeling the fever burn through her skin. Through those fevered nights, Jorunn speaks of things she has never mentioned before. She speaks of her grandmother, a vulva named Helga, who lived far to the north. Helga knew the old ways of keeping food fresh through any season, techniques more powerful than simple salting or smoking. These methods were passed down through generations of wise women, sacred knowledge that combined practical skill with spiritual understanding. Jorunn tells Astrid about transformation rather than simple preservation, about teaching food to sleep through winter and wake fresh in spring, about the marriage between ice and warmth, between salt and sweetness, between death and life. Her grandmother could keep fish tasting as fresh in March as it did in October. She could store meat that remained tender and delicious through the longest winter. She knew secrets that most Vikings had forgotten or never learned. In her final hours, on the 3rd night of her illness, Jorunn presses a small leather pouch into Astrid's hands. Inside, Astrid finds dried herbs she does not recognize, and a fragment of parchment covered in runes and symbols. The parchment is old, the leather soft with age and handling. The runes speak of fermentation as sacred change, of ice harvested in winter darkness, of herbs gathered by moonlight. They mention a Sami wise woman named Berit, who dwells far to the north, beyond the mountains where the reindeer herds migrate. Find her, Jorun whispers, her voice barely audible above the wind outside. Learn what I could not complete. Save our people from this hunger. Promise me, Astrid. Promise me. Astrid promises, tears running down her face, knowing even as she speaks that her mother will not live to see the morning. Jorun dies 3 days before the winter solstice, on the longest night of the year. They bury her in the frozen ground, breaking the earth with iron picks, laying her to rest with her weaving tools and a small vessel of preserved berries, the only food in the household that has not spoiled. 15 other souls in the settlement receive burial that week. Most are the very young or very old, those whose bodies cannot endure hunger and cold together. Astrid stands at the burial mound in the weak midday twilight and makes a silent oath. She will master what her mother could not complete. She will learn the secret that her great-grandmother Helga knew. She will ensure no mother watches her children waste away from hunger when the stores fail. This becomes her purpose, her sacred mission, the reason she will live. Her father, Bergr, sits hollow-eyed by the fire. In the days after Jorun's death, he is a broad man, strong from years of shipbuilding, but grief bends him like an old tree in a storm. His ship, the Wave Rider, sits trapped in ice in the fjord. The carved dragon head at its prow stares uselessly across the frozen water. The crew cannot raid, cannot trade. Without plunder from England or goods from the eastern trade routes, the family faces not just hunger, but ruin. Bergr's workshop sits silent. No one commissions new ships when they struggle to survive the winter. The smell of fresh-cut wood and pine tar that usually fills the air is gone, replaced by cold and stillness. The tools hang on their pegs, unused. The half-finished hull of a small fishing boat sits abandoned, its ribs exposed like the ribs of Halvard's chest. But Astrid sees deeper than immediate suffering. She understands, in a way her father cannot yet grasp, that raiding brings only temporary wealth. They can fill their holds with English silver and Frankish goods, but that does not solve the fundamental problem. Every Viking household faces the same crisis year after year. They produce enough food in summer and autumn. The fjords teem with fish, the forests provide game, the small fields yield grain and vegetables. The problem is not production, the problem is preservation. They catch fish by the hundreds in summer, but half of it rots before spring. They slaughter cattle and pigs in autumn, but the meat spoils or becomes so dried and salted that it barely seems like food. They gather berries and vegetables, but within weeks they turn to mush or simply rot. The long northern darkness defeats them all, year after year, generation after generation. As spring's pale light finally returns in early March, Astrid examines her mother's inheritance carefully. She sits by the fire with the parchment spread before her, tracing the runes with her finger. The language is old, archaic even to her. Some words she recognizes, others she must puzzle out. The runes speak of transformation, of making food live through winter as if summer never ended. They describe fermentation as teaching food to change into something new, something that resists decay. The text mentions specific herbs, juniper, dill, wild thyme, and others with names Astrid does not know. It describes ice harvested in the deepest cold and stored through summer in pits lined with sawdust and bark. It speaks of the marriage between cold and warmth, of chambers where different processes occur, of buildings designed specifically for preserving food. Most importantly, it mentions Berit, the Sami woman who dwells beyond the mountains, the last keeper of the complete knowledge, the one who understands not just techniques but principles, not just methods but the living wisdom behind them. Astrid tells her father she will travel north to find this Berit. They argue by the fire while Halvard and Ragnhild sleep. Bergr forbids it immediately. The mountains shelter wolves and worse bears. Bitter cold, treacherous paths where one wrong step means death. A young woman cannot travel such distances alone. It is madness. It is suicide. He has lost his wife and will not lose his daughter to some foolish quest. But Astrid has inherited her mother's stubbornness and her father's courage. She argues back, her voice rising. What choice do they have? To sit and wait for next winter's hunger? To watch Halvard and Ragnhild grow thin again, perhaps to die next time? Every year the same struggle, the same losses, the same helpless watching as food rots and families starve? She reminds Bergr of the 15 graves on the hillside. She reminds him of her mother's dying wish. She tells him that someone must do something different, must learn something new, or the cycle will never break. The Norse people are brave enough to cross oceans and fight battles, but they lose more people to winter hunger than to English swords. Is that not a battle worth fighting? Bergr stares into the fire, for a long time. Finally, he nods. He will not stop her, but neither will he help her travel to what he sees as certain death. If she is determined to go, she will go with his blessing but not his support. He is a practical man, and he sees no practical outcome to this quest. But as the snow melts and the ice breaks up in the fjord, Bergr's resistance softens. Perhaps grief has taught him that life is short and chances must be taken. Perhaps he sees in Astrid's determination an echo of the wife he loved. On the day before Astrid plans to leave, he gives her a bag of silver pennies from his carefully hoarded savings, enough to buy passage on ships, to trade for food and shelter, to survive the journey. "Find your Sami woman," he says gruffly. "Learn her secrets. Come home safe. That is all I ask." Astrid embraces her father, feeling his strength and his fear in equal measure. She promises to return. She promises to learn. She promises to bring back knowledge that will change everything. In mid-April, when the first green appears on the hillsides, Astrid Bergsdottir leaves her father's longhouse. She carries a pack with dried food, extra clothing, her mother's leather pouch with the parchment and herbs, and her father's silver. She wears sturdy boots and a heavy cloak. She has a knife at her belt and determination in her heart. Halvard and Ragnhild, recovered somewhat with spring's arrival and better food, stand at the doorway watching their older sister leave. They do not understand where she is going or why. They know only that another member of their family is disappearing into the unknown. Ragnhild cries. Halvard tries to be brave, but his lower lip trembles. Astrid kneels before them. She promises she will return. She promises she will bring back something that will keep them safe through all the winters to come. She promises that when she comes back, no one in their household will ever go hungry again. Then she stands, shoulders her pack, and walks away from the only home she has ever known. She does not look back. If she looks back, she might lose her courage. If she looks back, she might see her father's fear or her siblings' tears and decide to stay. So she walks forward, down the path toward the fjord, toward the first ship that will carry her north, toward a journey that will consume the next 4 years of her life and change the course of Viking history. The sun climbs higher in the spring sky. Ice melts in the streams, running down from the mountains in cold, clear cascades. Life returns to the land after winter's death. And Astrid, 17 years old, walks into her future, carrying the past in a leather pouch and hope in her heart. Part 2. The Path Through Ancient Wisdom. Astrid's journey begins with a merchant ship departing from the fjord in late April of 863 after Christ. The captain, a weathered man named Ulf, accepts her silver for passage to Trondheim, the growing trade centre far to the north. The wave strider cuts through the coastal waters, hugging the shore where countless islands provide shelter from the open ocean's fury. Astrid stands at the rail, watching the familiar coastline of Hordaland disappear behind her. The fjords carve deep into the mountains, their steep sides still streaked with snow despite spring's arrival. Waterfalls tumble down the cliffs in white cascades, seabirds wheel and cry in the clean air. The ship's sail fills with wind, the rigging creaks, and the bow slices through the grey-green water. Other passengers huddle near the mast, a priest travelling to preach in northern settlements, 2 merchants carrying goods to trade, a family relocating to claim land near Trondheim. They eye Astrid with curiosity. A young woman travelling alone is unusual, perhaps suspicious. The priest, Father Cole, asks her destination and purpose. She tells him she travels to study with wise women who know herb lore and healing. It is truth enough without revealing everything. The voyage takes 8 days, the ship anchoring each night in protected coves or small harbours. Astrid learns the rhythm of sea travel, the constant motion, the salt spray, the careful rationing of food and water. She watches how the crew preserves their provisions for the voyage. They have salted fish and dried meat, the same foods that failed her family through winter. But these are meant to last only days, not months. The question of long-term preservation remains unanswered. Trondheim sprawls around its harbour, larger than any settlement Astrid has seen. Dozens of ships cluster at the docks, longships preparing for raids, trading vessels from Denmark and Sweden, even a ship from far-off Kiev with strange letters painted on its sail. The town buzzes with activity. Merchants shout prices, sailors unload cargo, smiths hammer iron, and the smell of cooking fish drifts from 100 houses. Astrid finds lodging at a guest house near the harbour, paying 2 silver pennies for a week's food and bed. The owner, a widow named Thora, looks at Astrid with shrewd eyes and asks few questions. Thora has seen many young women arrive in Trondheim seeking new lives, fleeing difficult situations, or searching for something they cannot name. She provides a safe place and expects no confidences in return. Through Thora, Astrid learns of the spring market where Sami traders come down from the north to sell reindeer hides, antler, and preserved meat. She spends 3 days wandering the market, watching and listening. The Sami merchants are different from the Norse, smaller in stature, with distinctive clothing of layered furs and colourful woven belts. They speak Norse with heavy accents, mixing in their own language. Astrid approaches a Sami woman selling strips of dried reindeer meat. The meat looks different from Norse dried meat, darker, firmer, with a rich smell that makes Astrid's mouth water. She buys a strip with a copper coin and tastes it. The flavour is intense, concentrated, nothing like the leathery jerky she knows. It chews easily despite being dried, and the taste is clean without the overwhelming saltiness that usually accompanies preservation. "How do you make it?" Astrid asks. The woman smiles, showing gaps in her teeth. "The wind and the cold," she says, "and knowing when. Not too early, not too late, when the season turns just right." Astrid asks more questions, but the woman only shakes her head. "You want to learn the way? You learn from someone who teaches, not from market talk." But the woman's husband, overhearing, mentions that he knows a Völva who lives inland, a Norse woman who has studied with many different peoples. For 3 silver pennies, he will guide Astrid to this woman's dwelling. Astrid agrees immediately, her first real lead since leaving home. 2 days later, Astrid travels with the Sami couple and 3 other traders into the forests east of Trondheim. They follow paths invisible to Astrid's eyes, winding between enormous pines and across streams still cold with snowmelt. The forest is dense and dark, the canopy blocking much of the sky. The traders move confidently, but Astrid struggles to keep pace, her pack heavy and her legs unused to the rough terrain. They reach a small clearing on the 3rd day where a turf house sits beside a stream. Smoke rises from a hole in the roof. Dogs bark at their approach, and an old woman emerges, leaning on a staff carved with elaborate designs. This is Sigrid, the Völva the traders promised. Sigrid examines Astrid with eyes that seem to see through skin to bones beneath. She asks Astrid's name, her lineage, her purpose. When Astrid explains about her mother's death and the parchment mentioning Berit, Sigrid's expression shifts to something like respect. "You seek Berit," Sigrid says. "That is a long journey, and Berit does not teach everyone, but you will not reach her without preparation. The mountains are not kind to the ignorant. Stay here. Learn what you can. Perhaps by autumn you will be ready." Astrid stays. Through the spring and summer of 863 after Christ, she lives in Sigrid's clearing, learning the first layers of preservation wisdom. Sigrid teaches her about fermentation, the sacred transformation that changes food from one thing into another. They begin with cabbage. Sigrid shows Astrid how to shred the leaves, massage them with salt until they release their liquid, pack them tightly into a clay crock with no air spaces. The salt draws out water, creating brine. The cabbage must stay submerged beneath this brine, weighted down with stones. Then comes the waiting. The spirits move through it, Sigrid explains. Tiny spirits you cannot see but can taste. They eat the cabbage's sweetness and make it sour. They protect it from the rot spirits. This is transformation. This is teaching food to change and live. Astrid watches the crock for days, noting how bubbles appear, rising through the brine. The smell changes from fresh cabbage to something tangy and sharp. After 2 weeks, Sigrid opens the crock and lets Astrid taste. The cabbage has transformed into something entirely different, sour, complex, alive in a way Astrid cannot quite explain. And it will last not weeks but months, perhaps through an entire winter if kept properly. They ferment other foods. Wild greens gathered from the forest, turnips and other roots, even meat, though this requires more care and knowledge. Sigrid teaches Astrid to taste the fermentation, to recognize the difference between good transformation and dangerous rot. The smell changes subtly. Good fermentation has a clean, sour smell, while rot brings something foul and wrong. Sigrid teaches prayers and songs that help remember the timing. 5 days for the quick ferment, the crunch that stays. 10 days for the soft tang, the lasting preservation. 15 days for the deep sour, the winter store. The rhythm helps Astrid remember, the words encoding, technical knowledge in memorable form. But Sigrid also teaches limitation. What I know is one piece, she says. Fermentation alone is not enough for all foods, all seasons. You need cold. You need ice that lasts through summer. You need herbs and knowledge I do not possess. For that, you must find Berit. As autumn colours the forest gold and red, Astrid prepares to continue her journey. Sigrid gives her a gift, a small wooden box containing various fermentation starters. Dried cultures that will begin new fermentations faster and more reliably than starting from nothing. These are valuable, representing years of careful cultivation. Berit will test you, Sigrid warns. She does not teach the unworthy. You must prove yourself strong, patient, and respectful. If you fail her tests, she will send you away, and you will have travelled all that distance for nothing. Astrid thanks Sigrid and departs as the first snow begins to fall. She follows a group of Sami herders who are moving their reindeer north and east toward winter grazing lands. The herders accept her presence for a handful of silver, tolerating this strange Norse woman who asks endless questions about their food preservation methods. The journey through the mountains tests Astrid's strength and will. The paths narrow to ribbons along cliff faces. Snow falls heavily, obscuring landmarks. The cold bites through her cloak despite its thickness. She learns to keep moving, to never stop for too long, to recognize the warning signs of frost starting to numb her fingers and toes. The herders teach her as they travel. They show her how they preserve meat in the natural cold of winter, how certain herbs gathered in the mountains prevent spoilage while adding flavor. They demonstrate how to read the weather in the clouds and the behavior of animals. A particular bird's call means snow within hours. A certain quality of light warns of dangerous cold approaching. One night, camped in a protected valley while a protected valley, blizzard rages outside. An elder herder named Ailu tells her about Berit. She is very old, he says, perhaps 70 winters, perhaps more. She learned from her mother, who learned from hers, going back many generations. She knows the complete way, fermentation, cold storage, herbs, construction, everything together, not just pieces. But she teaches only those who prove themselves worthy. How do I prove myself? Astrid asks. Ailu shrugs. That is for her to decide. Each person's test is different. Some she sends away immediately, others she tests for years. You must be prepared to stay, to work, to suffer if necessary. The herders part ways with Astrid in early December, pointing her toward Berit's dwelling a day's walk farther north. Ailu gives her directions: follow the frozen river to the lake, find the turf house on the eastern shore, announce yourself properly with respect. Do not demand, do not expect. Simply ask and accept what comes. Astrid walks alone through the winter landscape. The frozen river provides easy passage, its surface smooth as glass in some places, rough with pressure ridges in others. The sky holds only pale light even at midday, the sun barely clearing the horizon before beginning its descent. The cold is intense, deeper than anything she experienced in Hordaland. Her breath freezes on her cloak, ice forms on her eyelashes. She reaches the lake as darkness falls. On the far shore, she sees a small plume of smoke rising from what must be Bergrd's house. Astrid walks around the lake's edge, her legs shaking with exhaustion, her body desperate for warmth and rest. Finally, she stands before a small turf dwelling, its walls of earth and timber, its roof covered in snow. Light flickers through cracks around the door. Astrid knocks. No answer comes. She knocks again. Still nothing. She stands in the cold, uncertain what to do. Finally, she calls out in Norse, introducing herself, explaining her journey, asking respectfully if she might speak with Bergr. The door opens. An elderly woman stands in the warmth and firelight within. Her face is carved with deep wrinkles, her long white hair hangs in braids, and her eyes are sharp and black. This is Bergr. She looks at Astrid for a long moment, saying nothing, her expression unreadable. Finally, she speaks in heavily accented but clear Norse. "You are late. Winter is here. Come inside before you freeze to death on my threshold." Astrid stumbles inside, the warmth hitting her like a physical force. Her fingers burn as feeling returns, her legs barely hold her weight. Bergr closes the door and gestures to a spot by the fire. Astrid collapses there, too exhausted to speak, too cold to think. Bergr gives her hot broth and bread. Astrid eats mechanically, her body demanding food before her mind can fully process the situation. The house is small but meticulously organized. Dried herbs hang from the rafters, clay vessels line the walls, fish and meat hang in a far corner where it is cool but not frozen. Everything has its place, its purpose, its order. When Astrid finishes eating, Bergr speaks again. "You seek knowledge. Many seek knowledge. Most are not willing to pay the price. We shall see if you are different. Rest now. Tomorrow, we begin." Astrid sleeps by the fire, wrapped in furs Bergr provides, more exhausted than she has ever been in her life. She has travelled for 8 months across hundreds of miles. She has crossed mountains and forests and frozen rivers. She has reached the woman who holds the knowledge she seeks. But the real journey, she will learn, has only just begun. Bergr does not teach through words alone. She teaches through testing, through work, through suffering and success and failure. She teaches through the long northern winter when the sun barely rises, when the cold makes every task a struggle, when the only companions are silence and determination. 3 full moon cycles, Bergr says. 3 months of testing before she will even consider teaching the complete method. Astrid has come too far to turn back now. Whatever tests Bergr devises, whatever challenges await, Astrid will face them. She has promised her mother, she has promised herself. She will not fail. Outside, the winter night settles over the frozen landscape. Inside, by the fire's warmth, Astrid Bergsdottir sleeps and dreams of spring, of home, of the knowledge that will transform her people's future. The path through ancient wisdom has led her here, to this small house beside a frozen lake, to this elderly Sami woman who holds secrets passed down through generations. The real learning will begin with the morning light. Part 3. Building the House of Transformation. Bergrd's tests begin with the rising sun on Astrid's first full day. The elderly Sami woman wakes her before dawn and hands her a fishing line and hooks. "The lake has fish beneath its ice," Bergr says. "You will catch 6 before sunset. You will clean them and preserve them. I will not help. I will not instruct. Do what you think is right." Astrid stumbles out into the bitter cold. The lake stretches before her, its ice thick and solid. She has never ice-fished before but has watched men do it in the fjords. She finds a spot and begins chipping at the ice with a hand axe, working to create a hole. The ice is thicker than she expected, nearly 2 feet deep. Her hands ache from the work. Sweat soaks her underclothes despite the cold. Finally, water appears at the bottom of the hole. She drops her baited line through and waits. And waits. Hours pass. The weak sun climbs slightly above the horizon, then begins its descent. Astrid catches one fish, then another. But 6 seems impossible. Her fingers are numb. Her back aches from bending over the ice hole. Frustration wells up inside her. She remembers something Ailu the herder told her fish move to where the water is slightly warmer, to springs feeding the lake. She abandons her first hole and walks along to the shore, looking for signs of flowing water. There, where the ice is slightly thinner and darker that must be a spring, she chips a new hole and drops her line. The fish come faster here. 3 more before the sun sets, 6 total. She returns to Berit's house triumphant, only to face the next challenge, cleaning and preserving them with no guidance. Astrid cleans the fish efficiently. That much she knows from years of watching in Hordaland. But preservation? She has only Sigrid's teachings about fermentation and her observations of Sami methods. She decides to try multiple approaches: 2 fish salted and hung in the cold corner, 2 fish gutted and left to freeze solid, and 2 fish she attempts to ferment using techniques learned from Sigrid, packing them in salt and juniper berries in a clay vessel. Berit examines her work without comment. Over the following days, she checks the fish periodically, still saying nothing. Astrid waits, anxious, uncertain whether she has passed or failed. After 1 week, Berit brings out the fish. The hung fish have frozen solid but show signs of frost damage, the flesh crystallized and dry. The frozen fish have kept well but have lost texture. The fermented fish Berit opens the vessel and sniffs carefully. She tastes a small piece. Finally, she nods. "You understand transformation," Berit says. "Good. But you do not yet understand cold. Cold is not simple, freezing. Cold is balance, movement, timing. You will learn." Thus begins Astrid's education. Through the winter of 863 into 64 after Christ, Berit tests her repeatedly. Each test teaches through failure as much as success. Astrid must preserve reindeer meat without instruction. She oversalts it, making it inedible. She must build a small storage structure. Her design allows too much air movement, and food rots. She must gather herbs from the winter forest. She collects the wrong plants, and Berit makes her study the differences until she can identify them by touch in darkness. The testing is brutal but purposeful. Berit never explains why a method fails, forcing Astrid to reason through the problems herself. Did the meat rot because of too little salt or too much moisture? Did the fermentation fail because of wrong temperature or lack of starter culture? Each failure teaches something, etching lessons into Astrid's understanding through the sharp edge of mistake and correction. Between tests, Astrid works. She cuts firewood, hauls water, repairs tools, tends to the endless small tasks of winter survival. Berit works beside her, moving with the efficiency of long practice despite her age. They speak little. Berit does not tell stories or explain philosophy. She demonstrates through action, and Astrid must learn by observation. Gradually, Astrid notices patterns. Berit keeps different foods at different temperatures. Some hang in the coldest corner where they freeze solid. Others rest in a slightly warmer area where they remain cold but not frozen. Still others sit near the fire's heat, fermenting slowly. The house itself is designed to create these temperature zones, with careful attention to airflow and insulation. She notices Berit's timing. Certain foods are checked daily, others weekly. Fermentation vessels are opened, sniffed, tasted, then sealed again. Berit knows by smell alone whether transformation progresses correctly or veers toward rot. This knowledge comes from decades of experience, and Astrid realizes she must develop her own senses through similar practice. Spring arrives slowly in the far north. By April of 864 after Christ, the sun stays above the horizon longer each day. Astrid has been with Berit for 4 months. She has failed more tests than she has passed, but each failure teaches something crucial. Then comes the greatest test. Berit tells Astrid she must survive alone in the forest for 1 full moon cycle, 28 days. She must catch or gather her own food and preserve it using everything she has learned. She may take basic tools but no preserved food. If she returns alive and well-fed, proving she can sustain herself through preservation knowledge, then Berit will consider teaching her the complete method. Astrid departs into the forest in early May, when the snow is melting but nights remain cold. She carries an axe, a knife, fishing line and hooks, a small pot, flint and steel, and one wool blanket. Nothing more. She must survive on her knowledge alone. The first days are the hardest. Astrid builds a rough shelter against a rock outcropping, gathering pine boughs for insulation. She catches fish from a stream swollen with snowmelt. She gathers early greens and roots. But catching food is only the beginning. She must preserve it, to prove her knowledge. She builds a small smoking structure, smoking fish over a carefully tended fire. She digs a pit in a shaded area where snow still lingers, creating a makeshift cold storage. She gathers wild herbs, juniper, thyme, others she recognizes from Berit's teachings and uses them in preservation. She experiments with fermentation, packing fish in salt and herbs, burying the vessel in cool earth. The solitude is profound. Days pass with no human voice but her own. She talks to herself sometimes, singing the preservation songs Sigrid taught her, repeating the timing rhymes until they are burned into memory. She watches birds and animals, learning their patterns. She observes how the returning sun changes everything, where shadows fall, where frost lingers, where warmth encourages growth. She makes mistakes. One batch of fish rots because she used too little salt in the fermentation. She wastes precious calories on this failure. Hunger sharpens her focus. She catches more fish and tries again, this time with better proportion. The second batch succeeds, the fish transforming into something tangy and preserved. 28 days pass in a blur of work and solitude. Astrid emerges from the forest thinner but stronger, her pack filled with preserved foods, smoked fish, fermented fish, dried greens, even a small amount of frozen meat kept in an insulated basket packed with moss and bark. She looks half wild, her hair tangled, her clothes dirty, but her eyes burn with quiet pride. Berit examines every item. She sniffs, tastes, tests. The smoked fish is adequate, the dried greens are good. The fermented fish makes her pause. She takes another taste, studying Astrid with sharp eyes. Finally, she speaks. You have learned to survive. That is the first requirement, but survival alone is not mastery. Now, if you are willing to stay another season, I will teach you what you truly came to learn. Astrid stays. Through the summer of 864 after Christ, Berit reveals the complete system. It is not one technique but a symphony of them, working together in careful balance. Fermentation provides the foundation. Berit teaches Astrid the deep principles, not just that fermentation works, but why. The tiny invisible spirits that Sigrid mentioned are real, even if no one can see them. They eat food's natural sugars and create acids that other rot-causing spirits cannot survive in. The key is encouraging the right spirits while preventing the wrong ones. Salt plays a crucial role, but not in the way most Vikings use it. Heavy salting preserves by making food too salty for any spirits to survive, good or bad. But this makes food hard and nearly inedible. Berit teaches the narrow path, just enough salt to slow the bad spirits while allowing good fermentation spirits to thrive. The balance is delicate and requires constant attention. Cold is the second pillar, but cold alone, as Astrid learned, damages food. Freezing creates ice crystals that tear apart flesh, making it dry and tasteless when thawed. The solution is cold, that approaches freezing without quite reaching it. This requires careful temperature control. Berit teaches her to build the ice pit, a deep hole lined with stones, insulated with sawdust and bark. Ice from the lake, cut in winter, fills this pit. Through careful design, the ice lasts through summer, providing constant cold without the damage of freezing. Meat and fish stored just above the ice remain fresh for months, the near-freezing temperature slowing all decay without creating ice crystals. Herbs provide the third element. Berit takes Astrid into the forest and mountains, teaching her to recognize dozens of plants. Juniper berries contain oils that fight rot. Wild thyme has similar properties. Certain bark provides tannins that preserve. Moss, collected from specific locations, has antibacterial qualities. Each herb serves a purpose, and combinations work better than any single plant. But the greatest revelation is the architecture, the preservation house, the fresh house, that combines all these elements into a single structure. Berit teaches Astrid to design buildings specifically for preservation. The structure must be partially underground for natural temperature control. It needs separate chambers for different processes, one for ice storage, one for fermentation, one for drying, one for herb-infused preservation. Air movement is critical. Cold air must flow through underground channels, entering the building from the coolest side. Warm air must exit through roof vents on the opposite side. This creates constant circulation that prevents moisture buildup while maintaining steady cold temperatures. The Vikings build impressive halls and ships, but they have never applied this engineering knowledge to food storage. Through late summer and autumn of 864 after Christ, Astrid helps Berit build an improved preservation house, incorporating everything she has learned. They dig the earth pit together, line it with stones, create ventilation channels. They construct walls of turf and timber, design chambers, build vessels and racks. The work is exhausting but purposeful. Every detail matters, every measurement affects function. As they work, Berit finally explains her philosophy. Preservation is not defeating nature, she says. It is dancing with nature, understanding its rhythms, using its tools. Cold exists, we can harness it. Fermentation happens, we can guide it. Herbs grow, we can apply them. The key is understanding that food is alive, even in death. We must respect that life, work with it, transform it, rather than simply kill it. This understanding transforms everything Astrid has learned into a coherent whole. She is not fighting rot, but encouraging beneficial transformation. She is not forcing food to stay unchanged, but teaching it to change in helpful ways. The spiritual dimension her mother spoke of, that Sigrid honored, that Berit practices, it is not superstition but deep understanding expressed in religious language. Winter comes again. Through the cold months of 864 into 65 after Christ, Astrid practices everything Berit has taught. They preserve the autumn harvest together, fish from the lake, reindeer meat from Sami hunters, wild berries and vegetables, herbs gathered throughout the growing season. Every technique Astrid learned separately now works in concert. By spring of 865 after Christ, Astrid knows she has mastered the complete system. The food they preserved in autumn remains fresh and delicious in March. The ice pit still holds cold despite the returning sun. The fermented foods have reached perfect maturity. She can taste the fermentation's progress, smell the difference between good transformation and dangerous rot, adjust salt and herbs by intuition as much as measurement. Berit, now teaching a student who has proven herself completely, reveals one final secret. She shows Astrid a small wooden box containing dried fermentation cultures, starters that will begin new fermentations quickly and reliably. These cultures are the result of generations of selection, encouraging the best transformation spirits while excluding dangerous ones. My mother gave these to me, Berit says. Her mother gave them to her. Now I give them to you. Guard them, use them wisely. Pass them to someone worthy when your time comes. In late spring of 865 after Christ, Astrid prepares to return home. She has been gone nearly 2 years. She carries with her more than knowledge, she carries understanding, skill honed through practice, and the confidence of someone who has been tested and succeeded. Berit gives her supplies for the journey and one final gift, detailed drawings showing the construction of the preservation house, the fresh house, from multiple angles. These drawings, marked with measurements and notes, will allow Astrid to replicate the structure without relying on memory alone. On the day of departure, the two women stand outside Berit's house in the spring sunshine. The lake's ice is melting, revealing dark water beneath. Birds sing in the returning warmth. Life renews itself, as it does every spring, But now Astrid carries knowledge to help her people survive when life retreats in winter's darkness. You will face resistance, Berit warns. People fear change, especially change from unexpected sources. A young woman teaching new methods will find many who mock and resist. Be patient. Let your results speak. Those who are ready will learn. Those who are not will eventually come around or die off. Astrid embraces the old woman, feeling the fragility of her frame, but also the steel strength within. Thank you, she says simply. The words are inadequate for 2 years of teaching, testing, and transformation, but they are all she has. Do not thank me, Berit replies. Teach others. That is the only thanks any teacher needs to see knowledge passed forward, not hoarded or lost. Go now. Your people wait, though they do not know it yet. Astrid walks away from the lake, following the river south, retracing her path toward home. She is 21 years old. She has crossed mountains, survived in wilderness, learned from wise women who hold ancient knowledge. She carries in her mind and hands the skills to transform Norse food culture. She carries hope in her pack and determination in her heart. The journey home takes 3 months, traveling with Sami herders and merchant ships, sleeping in forest camps and coastal settlements. She reaches Trondheim in summer and stays briefly with Sigrid, sharing what she learned with the Volva who started her on this path. Sigrid is delighted and humbled, recognizing that Astrid has gone far beyond what she could teach. Finally, in early autumn of 865 after Christ, Astrid arrives in the fjords of Hordaland. The wave rider sits at anchor in the harbour, newly repaired, preparing for a raid on the English coast. She walks up the familiar path to her father's longhouse, her heart pounding with anticipation and anxiety. Bergr stands in the doorway, grey-bearded and weathered. He stares at his daughter as if seeing a ghost. Halvard and Ragnhild run to embrace her, both of them grown. Halvard, now a strong youth training with the ship crews. Ragnhild, a girl of 11 on the edge of womanhood. They thought she might be dead. She has been gone 2.5 years with no word. Astrid tells them she has not been wasting time. She has been learning, training, preparing to fulfill her promise. Now she is ready. She will build a preservation house that will keep their food fresh through any winter. She will teach them methods that will ensure no one in their family ever starves again. She will prove that the journey, the time, the risk, all of it was worth it. Bergr looks at his daughter, now a woman, and sees something in her eyes he has never seen before: absolute certainty. He nods slowly. Then build your house, he says. Show us what you have learned. Prove that your mother's dream was not just a dying woman's wish, but something real. Astrid smiles. The challenge is accepted. The real work begins now. Part 4. The Golden Age of Plenty. The autumn of 865 after Christ brings Astrid her first real challenge, not surviving in wilderness or passing Berit's tests, but convincing her own community to trust her vision. She begins construction of the preservation house beside her father's longhouse, working with Bergr's reluctant blessing but the community's open skepticism. The project requires significant resources. She needs timber for framing, stones for lining the ice pit, turf for insulation, tools for digging and building. Bergr provides what he can, but silver is tight after 2 years without raiding. Astrid uses some of the silver she saved from her journey and trades her labour, weaving, cooking, mending for materials and help. The settlement's children gather to watch and laugh. The structure looks strange, wrong, half buried in the earth like a tomb. Why dig down when everyone builds up? Why create multiple small chambers instead of one large storage room? The design makes no sense to anyone who has not learned what Astrid knows. Father Olaf, the Christian priest, watches with narrowed eyes. He has heard rumours that Astrid studied with Sami sorcerers and pagan vulvas. He does not directly oppose her work, but his disapproval is clear. He makes comments during services about trusting in God's providence rather than worldly tricks, about the dangers of pagan practices disguised as innocent crafts. The older women of the settlement are even more hostile. Gudrun, wife of the wealthy farmer Thorstein, leads the mockery. She is a proud woman who has managed her household for 20 years, who considers herself an expert in preservation. This young woman who disappeared for 2 years now returns claiming to know better than experienced housewives. It is insulting, laughable, perhaps dangerous. Let her try, Gudrun says loudly at the communal well where women gather to draw water. Let her waste her father's silver on this strange earth house. When winter comes and her food rots like everyone else's, she will learn humility. But Astrid keeps working. Through autumn, she digs the earth pit with help from Halvard and 2 young thralls Bergr owns. The pit must be 6 feet deep, lined with flat stones to prevent collapse, designed with drainage so water from melting ice does not flood the chamber. She creates ventilation channels that run underground from the north side, where cold air naturally accumulates, to the south side where it enters the building. The main structure rises slowly, walls of turf and timber, carefully insulated, with a sod roof that will be covered in snow for additional insulation come winter. Inside, she creates 4 separate chambers. The largest holds the ice pit. Another contains racks and shelves for hanging and storing items in the cold air above the ice. The third is the fermentation chamber, positioned to catch warmth rising from the earth below and maintain a steady temperature perfect for transformation. The fourth is a drying chamber with carefully designed airflow. By the time the first snow falls, the basic structure is complete. Now comes the test actually preserving food using methods no one in Hordaland has seen before. Astrid takes the autumn catch and slaughter fish from the fjord, a pig Bergr slaughtered, vegetables from their small field, and applies everything Berit taught her. Some fish she ferments using the starter cultures Berit gave her, packing them in crocks with precisely measured salt and juniper berries. Other fish she hangs above the ice pit, where they remain cold but not frozen. The pork she treats in sections, some smoked traditionally, some fermented with herbs, some stored in the ice chamber. Vegetables go into fermentation vessels, transforming slowly through late autumn. Meanwhile, Thorstein's household prepares food in traditional ways. Gudrun uses heavy salt on everything, smokes meat until it is nearly black, dries fish on outdoor racks where weather and temperature fluctuate wildly. She has more resources than Bergr, more salt purchased from traders, a larger smokehouse, bigger storage buildings. By all conventional measures, her food should keep better. Winter comes hard and early, just like 2 years before. By midwinter, the settlement again faces familiar problems. Salted fish develops slime despite the cold. Smoked meat, kept in uninsulated storage, shows signs of rot. The heavily salted portions remain technically edible, but taste so strongly of brine that even hungry people struggle to eat them. In Bergr's longhouse, Astrid monitors her preservation house carefully. She checks the ice pit. The ice she collected from the fjord in early winter remains solid, keeping the chamber cold. She inspects hanging fish and meat. They remain fresh-looking, firm, without signs of rot. She opens fermentation vessels, sniffing and tasting to assess their progress. Everything is working as Berit promised. At midwinter, when days are shortest and spirits traditionally lowest, Bergr holds a small feast for neighboring families. It is not traditional to feast at midwinter. Food should be rationed carefully, preserved stores stretched to last until spring. But Bergr wants to demonstrate what his daughter has accomplished. Astrid serves dishes that seem impossible for late December. Fish that tastes fresh, not salted to leather. Pork that remains tender and flavorful. Fermented cabbage that brings tangy brightness to the winter meal. Root vegetables that retain their texture instead of becoming mushy. Even preserved berries that taste almost as sweet as summer fruit. The guests eat in shocked silence. Thorstein and Gudrun attend, their expressions shifting from skepticism to confusion to something approaching alarm. This should not be possible. Food does not stay this fresh, this delicious, through winter months. Yet here it is, undeniable evidence on wooden plates before them. After the meal, Thorstein approaches Bergr. His pride is wounded, but his pragmatism wins. "Your daughter's methods," he says carefully. "They seem effective. Perhaps Gudrun could learn them. For a fair price." Bergr looks at Astrid. This is her knowledge, Her decision. Astrid considers. She remembers her mother's death, the 15 graves on the hillside, the hunger that has plagued her people for generations. She remembers Berit's final words about teaching others, about passing knowledge forward rather than hoarding it. "I will teach anyone who wants to learn," Astrid says. "Not for silver, for the promise that they will teach others in turn. Knowledge should spread like seeds, not be locked away like treasure." Thus begins Astrid's teaching in 866 after Christ. Gudrun arrives at Bergr's longhouse the next day, her pride bent but not broken, ready to learn. Other women follow. Some come from curiosity, others from desperate need. Astrid teaches them patiently, showing them how to build smaller preservation structures, how to ferment foods, how to use ice and cold effectively. She discovers she has a talent for teaching. The songs and rhythms Sigrid taught her, the patient instruction Berit modelled, the understanding earned through her own failures, all of this makes her an effective teacher. She does not simply tell women what to do, but helps them understand why. She explains about the invisible transformation spirits, about salt balance, about temperature control. She teaches them to use their senses, to smell and taste and touch their way to success. Word spreads along the fjords and trade routes. Ship captains stopping in Hordaland hear about this young woman whose preserved food remains fresh through winter. They tell others. More families arrive seeking instruction. By summer of 866 after Christ, Astrid is teaching women from settlements days away. Then comes the proposition that changes everything. A jarl named Hakon the Red arrives from Bergen with a small fleet in late summer of 866 after Christ. Hakon is a powerful man, controlling territories from Bergen north to Trondheim, with influence reaching to Denmark and the Norwegian islands. He has heard about Astrid from ship crews who ate her preserved provisions on extended voyages. Hakon is perhaps 50 years old, red-bearded as his name suggests, a veteran of countless raids and battles. He sits in Bergr's longhouse, drinks ale, and makes his offer directly. "Come to Bergen," he says. "Establish your teaching there. Train women from across my territories. I will provide land, buildings, protection. In return, my ships will have access to superior provisions. My households will not starve in hard winters. Your methods will spread to hundreds of families." "And the price?" Astrid asks. She is 22 years old, but has learned caution through hard experience. "You will train only those I approve. The knowledge will benefit my people, my allies. In exchange, you and your family receive wealth, status, protection. Your father's ships receive priority access to my harbours. A good bargain for everyone." Astrid considers. Bergen is the largest settlement in Norway, a thriving trade centre with connections across the Viking world. Teaching there would multiply her impact far beyond what she can achieve in Hordaland. But Hakon wants control, wants to direct who learns and who does not. This conflicts with her vision of knowledge spreading freely. She makes a counteroffer. She will come to Bergen and establish teaching there, but she will train anyone who sincerely wants to learn, not just Hakon's chosen few. She will establish schools where women learn preservation, alongside other skills, herb lore, weaving, accounting, even reading runes. These schools will be women's spaces, independent, of male control, places where knowledge passes from teacher to student in the old way. Hakon laughs at her boldness, but he also recognizes her value. After negotiating details, they reach agreement. Astrid will move to Bergen. Hakon will provide land and resources. She will have freedom to teach as she sees fit, within reason. The partnership is sealed with an exchange of gifts. Hakon gives Bergr a fine sword. Astrid gives Hakon preserved foods for his journey home, foods that will still taste fresh when he reaches Bergen days later. In autumn of 867 after Christ, Astrid leaves Hordaland again, this time not alone but with purpose and support. She travels to Bergen with Bergr's blessing and Hakon's patronage. The settlement that mocked her construction project 2 years ago now speaks of her with pride. She has proved herself. She has changed minds through results rather than arguments. Bergen sprawls around its harbour, a settlement becoming a city. Dozens of ships cluster at the docks. Merchants from across Scandinavia and beyond conduct business. Craftsmen work at their trades: smiths, carpenters, weavers, leather workers. The town hums with commerce and ambition. Hakon provides Astrid with land on the town's eastern edge, near freshwater streams and forest access. She begins construction of her first formal teaching facility, a complex of buildings including preservation houses, living quarters for students, workrooms for instruction. The project takes 2 years to complete, requiring significant labor and resources. Hakon provides initial funding, but Astrid must prove the investment worthwhile through results. The first formal school opens in 869 after Christ. 20 young women arrive that first year, coming from across Norway and even from Danish settlements. They come to learn preservation but receive broader education. Astrid teaches them household management, herb identification, basic healing, accounting, negotiation skills. She teaches them to read runes so they can record knowledge and communicate across distances. She empowers them to be not just skilled workers, but independent thinkers and leaders. The teaching combines practical work with theoretical understanding. Students spend mornings in the preservation houses, hands-on experience with fermentation, cold storage, and herb preparation. Afternoons offer instruction in principles, why methods work, how to adapt them to different conditions, what to do when things go wrong. Evenings offer broader education stories and songs that encode knowledge, history of their people, discussions of household economics and politics. The first students graduate after 2 years of training in 871 after Christ. They return to their homes carrying knowledge and confidence. Within a year, reports arrive of their success. Families that employed Astrid-trained women report better preservation, less waste, more successful winters. Demand for trained women skyrockets. Through the 870s after Christ, Astrid's reputation grows beyond Norway's borders. Danish jarls send their daughters to Bergen for training. Swedish merchants seek Astrid-trained women to manage their households. Even the Norse settlements in Ireland and the Scottish Islands hear of her methods and send students. The political implications ripple outward. Jarls and kings realize that food security equals military power. Harald Fairhair, working to consolidate Norway under his rule through the late 870s after Christ, recognizes that armies march on their stomachs. Well-fed troops campaign longer and fight harder. He invests in preservation infrastructure, building networks of storage houses along military routes, employing Astrid-trained women to manage supplies. The Danish Great Army that ravages England through the 870s and 80s uses superior logistics to maintain extended campaigns. While English defenders struggle to feed armies away from home, Danish forces bring preserved provisions that remain edible for months. The military advantage of superior preservation becomes clear in battlefield success. Trade transforms as well. Preserved Norse goods become luxury items in European markets. Fermented fish that Astrid perfected what will later be called gravlax commands premium prices in Frankish and Byzantine markets. Preserved furs and leathers arrive in Constantinople still fresh and supple, amazing merchants who have never seen such quality. The economic power of preservation knowledge strengthens Norse trading positions across Europe. By 880 after Christ, Astrid operates 3 schools, the original in Bergen, a second in Trondheim, and a third in newly settled Iceland. The Icelandic school is particularly important. Settlement of that harsh island began around 874 after Christ with Ingolfur Arnarsson's homestead. Success in Iceland depends entirely on surviving brutal winters lasting 8 months. Astrid's methods, carried by trained women, make permanent settlement possible. Without them, Iceland remains uninhabitable. With them, a new Norse civilization takes root in the North Atlantic. Astrid herself becomes a figure of political influence. She corresponds with Queen Aud the Deep-Minded, one of Iceland's most powerful settlers, sharing techniques adapted for that harsh environment. She advises Harald Fairhair on logistics for his campaigns to unite Norway. She mediates disputes between rival jarls, her neutral position and universal respect, giving her authority in conflicts where warriors would only escalate violence. Kings seek marriages with women trained in Astrid's schools, recognizing that household management skill equals political power. A jarl's daughter trained in Bergr brings more value than one who merely knows traditional methods. The preservation masters become subtle kingmakers, their networks of trained women creating alliances that cross traditional power boundaries. The cultural flowering is genuine. Feasting culture reaches new heights when jarls can display year-round abundance. No longer does winter mean rationing and dull food. With Astrid's preservation methods, winter feasts can rival autumn harvests in quality and variety. The political significance is profound. Generosity and abundance demonstrate power and attract loyalty. Poet-skalds compose verses celebrating Astrid as they once celebrated warriors. The saga of Astrid the Provider begins circulating orally, growing with each telling. She becomes a character in stories, sometimes realistic, sometimes mythologized. Artists carve preservation scenes into church doorways and ship prows. The aesthetic of food changes. Fermented, tangy, complex flavors become sophisticated, while bland, fresh food seems simple and unsophisticated. Religious syncretism occurs as Christianity spreads through Scandinavia. Christian priests cannot eliminate preservation practices, so they baptize them instead. Saints' feast days align with preservation schedules. St. Michael's Day marks the autumn slaughter. St. Martin's Day, the beginning of winter storage. Prayers to the Virgin Mary for blessing food stores replace prayers to Frigg, but the underlying practices continue unchanged. Astrid herself, raised pagan but pragmatic, accepts Christian baptism in 890 after Christ. She is 44 years old and recognizes that resisting Christianity is futile. She incorporates Christian prayers into her teaching while maintaining the spiritual dimensions that make preservation sacred rather than merely practical. To her, fermentation's transformation mirrors Christ's transformation of bread and wine in the Eucharist. Some bishops disagree, but most accept this interpretation as bringing useful pagan practices under church authority. By 900 after Christ, Astrid is 54 years old, her hair silver, her face lined with age but her mind sharp as ever. She has trained over 300 women directly, and those women have trained thousands more. The preservation schools operate in Bergen, Trondheim, Iceland, and recently in Dublin and York, where Norse settlements control trade. Her network spans the Viking world, invisible infrastructure of knowledge and skill undergirding Norse expansion and prosperity. But she begins noticing troubling signs. Some trained women hoard techniques for profit rather than sharing freely as Astrid taught. They guard secrets, charge high prices, create artificial scarcity of knowledge. Rival schools emerge teaching inferior methods more quickly and cheaply, appealing to families who view preservation as overhead rather than art. Students rush through training to capitalize on their skills, missing crucial subtleties that separate adequate from excellent. The sacred dimension fades as preservation becomes business. The songs and prayers that encode knowledge fall away, replaced by simple lists of instructions. The holistic understanding fermentation, cold storage, herbs, architecture, timing, spiritual practice, all working together fragments into disconnected techniques. Some practitioners ferment without understanding transformation. Others use herbs without knowing their properties. The system degrades as pieces separate from the whole. Astrid tries to maintain standards through a council of master teachers, but controlling quality across vast distances proves impossible. She writes down complete methods in runic texts, hoping future generations can refer to written wisdom, but she worries that writing cannot capture lived knowledge, the touch that tells you fermentation is perfect, the smell that warns of dangerous rot, the intuition developed through years of practice. In 915 after Christ, now 69 years old, Astrid steps back from daily teaching. She appoints her most skilled students as masters to run the schools. She returns to visit her aged father in Hordaland. Bergr is now 87 years old, frail but still alive, proud of his daughter's accomplishments beyond anything he imagined when she first proposed her strange journey north. Astrid helps Halvard, now managing the family homestead, build an improved preservation house, incorporating decades of refinements. She trains her grandnieces and nephews, hoping to anchor knowledge in family tradition. She writes more detailed texts, knowing her time grows short, desperate to preserve everything she can for future generations. She feels the tide turning. The golden age that began with her return from Berit's dwelling cannot last forever. Knowledge institutions rise and fall like kingdoms. The question is not whether her schools will endure, but how much knowledge will survive when they inevitably fragment. Will enough remain to be recovered? Or will it scatter so completely that future generations must reinvent everything from nothing? These questions haunt her final years, but she continues teaching, writing, refining, hoping. The work is never complete. Knowledge requires constant tending, like fermentation requires monitoring, like cold storage requires maintenance. You cannot simply create it and walk away. It lives only when passed from mind to mind, from hand to hand, from generation to generation. The golden age of plenty, built on Astrid's lifetime of work, stands at its peak, but peaks, by definition, precede descent. The shadows are already lengthening, though most people, enjoying their abundance, do not yet see them. Part 5. Shadows over the storehouses. The first crack appears in 923 after Christ, 3 years after Astrid stepped back from active teaching. A merchant named Sven Ulfsson, called Sven the Clever by his admirers, and Sven the Cheapener by critics, opens a rival preservation school in Hedeby, the major Danish trade centre. Sven has studied in Bergen but left after only 1 year, impatient with Astrid's 2-year training program. He recognizes a business opportunity. Families want preservation knowledge but resist the time and expense of full training. Sven offers a solution. 6 months of instruction covering basic techniques, enough to achieve adequate preservation at fraction of the cost. His methods work, after a fashion. Sven teaches simplified fermentation without the deep understanding of transformation. He teaches salt-heavy methods that work reliably, if not deliciously. He teaches simple cold storage without sophisticated architecture. Students learn to preserve food well enough to survive winter, but they miss the subtleties that separate adequate from excellent. In good years, the difference barely shows. Food preserved by Sven's students keeps through winter. Families survive. The lower cost and faster training appeal to those who view preservation as overhead rather than art. Sven's school attracts many students, and he franchises his methods to other entrepreneurs who open similar schools across Scandinavia. By 930 after Christ, the market fragments. Bergen-trained women charge premium prices and require long training periods. Sven-trained women cost less and train faster. For most families, the choice seems obvious. Why pay more for marginal improvements? Adequate preservation is good enough. Astrid watches this development with frustration but accepts it as inevitable. You cannot force people to value what they do not understand, she tells her remaining masters. We continue teaching the complete way. Those who want excellence will find us. The others will learn from their mistakes, or they will not. But the problem runs deeper than competing schools. The political landscape shifts as Christianity consolidates power across Scandinavia. The new bishops view the preservation schools with increasing suspicion. These institutions operate outside church authority, teaching women to wield influence beyond their proper sphere, according to Christian doctrine. The schools trace their origins to pagan vulvas and Sami traditions, making them doubly suspicious. In 935 after Christ, the Archbishop of Hamburg-Bremen, who claims authority over Scandinavian churches, issues guidelines restricting women's education to approved Christian subjects. Spinning, weaving, Christian prayers, household obedience, these are acceptable. Preservation skills, tainted by pagan origins and association with vulva traditions, fall under scrutiny. The Archbishop does not directly ban the schools but makes clear that church approval is uncertain. King Håkon, the Good of Norway, converted to Christianity during his upbringing in England, returns to Norway in 934 after Christ determined to Christianize his realm. Håkon is personally supportive of Astrid's work. He remembers eating her preserved foods as a boy when his father, Hakon the Red, first supported her schools. But political necessity forces compromises. He cannot fully protect institutions the church views as problematic. Several preservation schools close under church pressure, or become absorbed into monasteries where male clergy control knowledge that was once women's domain. The Dublin school closes in 938 after Christ when local bishops threaten excommunication for women who attend. The York school survives only by accepting church oversight, losing much of its independence. Astrid herself, now 73 years old, becomes a symbolic battleground. Church authorities debate her legacy. She has been baptized, attends church, incorporates Christian prayers into her teaching, but she refuses to abandon the spiritual framework that makes preservation sacred rather than merely technical. To her, fermentation's transformation reflects divine power working through natural processes. The bishops see only pagan superstition, barely disguised by Christian language. In 942 after Christ, a devastating outbreak of illness strikes Bergr. The sickness brings vomiting, convulsions, and temporary madness. Modern historians would recognize ergot poisoning from contaminated rye grain, but to people of the time, the cause seems mysterious and terrifying. Dozens fall ill, several die. Fear grips the city. Opportunistic rivals blame Astrid's methods. A priest named Father Magnus preaches that the sickness is God's judgment on those who trust pagan women's magic over proper Christian practices. He claims that fermentation encourages demonic spirits to infest food, that earth houses are built in imitation of pagan burial mounds to summon dark powers, that the entire system represents Satan's subtle corruption of Christian society. The accusations are absurd. Ergot poisoning comes from moldy grain, not preserved foods, and Astrid's methods actually prevent such contamination through proper storage and fermentation. But fear is not logical. Several families stop using preservation houses, returning to traditional heavy salting and smoking. Some even destroy fermentation vessels, seeing them as contaminated by demonic association. Astrid responds by opening her own preservation houses for inspection, demonstrating the cleanliness and safety of her methods, inviting Father Magnus himself to examine everything. Magnus refuses, unwilling to risk undermining his position with evidence that contradicts his claims. But his preaching continues, and the damage to Astrid's reputation spreads. The economic foundations erode simultaneously. Through the 930s and 40s after Christ, expanding trade networks bring cheaper salt from southern Europe and northern Africa. Spanish and Portuguese salt, harvested from coastal evaporation ponds, arrives in Scandinavian ports at prices that undercut Norwegian and Swedish sources. The elaborate fermentation and ice storage techniques make less economic sense when abundant, cheap salt allows simpler preservation. Families calculate costs and choose the easier path. Why invest in building a complex preservation house when you can simply buy more salt and use traditional methods? Why pay for 2 years of training when 6 months of basic instruction suffices? Why maintain ice pits and fermentation chambers when heavy salting works adequately and costs less? The mathematics are brutal. A preservation house costs perhaps 20 marks of silver to build properly. Maintenance requires ongoing labor and attention. Training a daughter for 2 years in Bergr costs additional silver for tuition and lost labor at home. In contrast, buying enough salt for a winter costs perhaps 5 marks, requires no special training, and uses methods everyone already knows. Political consolidation accelerates these trends. As stronger kings unite Scandinavia, Harald Greycloak following his father Harald Fairhair in Norway, Bluetooth unifying Denmark, Erik the Victorious consolidating Sweden's centralized royal authority, replaces the independent jarls and wealthy farmers who were Astrid's primary patrons. Royal officials prefer standardized, controllable methods over diverse regional practices. They promote uniform preservation standards that favor simplicity over excellence. The network of independent preservation masters that was Astrid's strength becomes a weakness in this new world. Kings want control, predictability, taxation of food stores. Astrid's system, built on women's networks and independent schools, resists royal authority. Some kings simply bypass it, establishing royal preservation standards that ignore or actively contradict what Astrid taught. Astrid tries to adapt. She corresponds with royal officials, offers to standardize her methods for royal approval, proposes crown-controlled preservation schools. But her age works against her. To young kings and bishops, she represents the past pagan-tainted, female-led, resistant to proper Christian authority. They smile politely at her proposals and implement their own systems. In 954 after Christ, Astrid falls ill. She is 88 years old, far beyond typical lifespan for her era. The sickness comes slowly: weakness, coughing, difficulty breathing. She knows this is the final illness. She returns to Hordaland one last time, to her father's longhouse where she was born, where her mother died, where her journey began nearly a century ago. Halvard, now an old man himself, cares for his sister through her final days. Ragnhild comes from her farm in the valley, bringing children and grandchildren to see Astrid one last time. Students arrive from across Scandinavia, women she trained decades ago, now old themselves, coming to say farewell to their teacher. Astrid uses her final strength to dictate additional texts, trying to capture every detail she fears might be lost. She repeats crucial information: the exact proportions of salt for different fermentations, the construction specifications for preservation houses, the properties of specific herbs, the timing of each process. She makes her students promise to continue teaching, to maintain standards, to resist the simplification and commercialization eroding the complete system. On a cold autumn day, in 958 after Christ, Astrid Bergsdottir dies peacefully in her sleep. She is 92 years old, having lived a life that transformed Viking culture and enabled Norse expansion across the North Atlantic. Her funeral draws hundreds former students, their daughters and granddaughters, ship captains whose crews ate her preserved food on voyages to Greenland and Vinland, jarls who owed their military successes to superior logistics. They bury her with honors usually reserved for jarls and kings. The Christian priests allow a semi-pagan funeral, recognizing her contributions despite their theological discomfort. They place in her grave preservation vessels, fermentation crocks, dried herbs, and her written texts, everything she valued in life. A stone is raised over her burial mound with runes declaring, "Here lies Astrid Provider, who taught the people to defeat winter." Her death removes the symbolic center holding her network together. Without Astrid's moral authority, without her living presence as founder and standard-bearer, the preservation schools fracture into competing factions. The Bergen school survives under new leadership, but struggles for students against cheaper alternatives. The Trondheim school closes within 5 years. The Icelandic school persists but evolves away from Astrid's original vision, adapting to local conditions in ways that lose crucial elements. A plague sweeps through Scandinavia in the 960s after Christ, perhaps bubonic plague reaching from the east, perhaps another disease. Records from this period are fragmentary, but the death toll is severe. Many of Astrid's master teachers die without passing on complete knowledge. The survivors huddle in reduced circumstances, unable to maintain the elaborate preservation schools amid social chaos and population decline. Written records burn when longhouses catch fire. Key texts are lost at sea when ships sink. The network of trained women, so carefully built over decades, begins breaking down. A master teacher dies in one region with no qualified successor. A school closes permanently because plague killed all the instructors. Knowledge fragments into isolated pockets, disconnected from the whole. By 990 after Christ, 32 years after Astrid's death, her techniques survive only in scattered form. Some families in Hordaland maintain relatively complete knowledge, passing it mother to daughter as sacred trust. In Iceland, certain households preserve more complete methods because the harsh environment makes them necessary for survival. But elsewhere, only pieces remain. The holistic system fermentation, plus ice storage, plus herbs, plus architectural design, plus spiritual practice, all working together fragments into disconnected techniques. One family ferments fish but has forgotten the herb combinations that prevent dangerous bacteria. Another maintains ice pits but has lost the architectural knowledge to make them last through summer. A third uses preservation herbs without understanding their properties or how to identify them reliably. The songs and rhymes that encoded timing and proportions fade from memory. The spiritual framework that made preservation sacred becomes dismissed as old women's superstition. The training schools that transmitted complete knowledge close or transform into something unrecognizable. The 2-year intensive education degrades to brief apprenticeships teaching simplified basics. Younger generations, drawn to Christian monasticism or merchant ventures, view preservation work as old-fashioned drudgery. Why spend years learning elaborate techniques when adequate methods take months to master? Why dedicate yourself to food storage when you could become a trader, a warrior, a priest with higher status and better prospects? The cultural transmission systems Astrid built women, teaching women over years of hands-on practice, master teachers maintaining standards, schools as centers of learning and community all require social conditions that are disappearing. Christianity restricts women's authority and independence. Political centralization disrupts regional networks. Economic change makes elaborate preservation less necessary. The foundations crumble, and the structure built on them cannot stand. By the end of the 10th century after Christ, Astrid's revolution is fading into history. Her name remains known, but her methods are fragmenting, her schools closing, her legacy uncertain. The golden age of plenty, so briefly achieved, slips back toward the hunger and waste that plagued her childhood. The shadows have lengthened into twilight, and darkness approaches. Part 6. The Long Forgetting. The 11th century after Christ brings comprehensive transformation of Norse society that systematically erases Astrid's legacy. The conversion to Christianity completes itself across Scandinavia, and with it comes the suppression of everything associated with the old pagan ways. King Olaf Tryggvason of Norway, ruling from 995 to 1000 after Christ, violently enforces Christianity. He destroys pagan temples, burns sacred groves, and forces conversion at sword point. His successor, Olaf Haraldsson, later Saint Olaf, continues this campaign through the early 1000s. They target runestones and documents associated with the old ways, seeing them as instruments of pagan corruption. Astrid's written preservation guides, inscribed with runes and containing references to pagan goddesses and vulva traditions, become targets. Christian authorities order such texts burned as heretical. The texts describe Frigg blessing food stores, Freya guiding fermentation, seasonal celebrations tied to pagan festivals. To zealous Christians, these are not innocent preservation techniques but dangerous pagan practices disguised as household knowledge. Some families hide their copies, burying them in remote locations or concealing them in walls. But time, fire, and active suppression destroy most. A preserved text discovered centuries later shows fire damage around the edges, barely saved from flames. Others dissolve in damp storage, the ink running, the knowledge bleeding away into illegibility. Still others simply disappear, lost when families die out or convert zealously and destroy their own pagan heritage. The institutional memory breaks in ways more subtle but equally destructive. Monasteries become centers of learning in Christian Scandinavia, but monks care little for women's household knowledge. They develop their own preservation techniques adequate but different from Astrid's sophisticated methods. Monastic preservation focuses on simplicity and replicability across many monasteries, not on the excellence that Astrid pursued. The chain of teacher-to-student transmission that kept Astrid's complete system alive depends on women teaching women over years of intensive apprenticeship. As Christianity restricts women's education and authority, this transmission chain breaks. Young women who might once have studied in Bergen for 2 years now learn only basic household skills from their mothers in a few months. The vulva tradition, which preserved so much pre-Christian knowledge, faces particular persecution. Vulvas are denounced as witches, their practices condemned as demon worship. The line of wise women stretching back to Astrid's great-grandmother Helga, even further back into unknown antiquity, snaps completely. The last vulvas die in hiding or convert to Christianity, abandoning practices that marked them for persecution. Changing settlement patterns accelerate knowledge loss. The old longhouse farms, with space for elaborate preservation structures, give way to more compact villages and growing towns. Urban households lack room for fresh houses with their underground pits and multiple chambers. They depend instead on markets and merchants for food. Specialized food sellers emerge who preserve food for profit, but they focus on volume and cost rather than quality. The Norwegian town of Bergen, where Astrid's largest school once stood, grows from settlement into major city. By 1050 after Christ, it holds thousands of people. Most live in small houses with no space for preservation architecture. They buy preserved fish and meat from merchants who use simplified methods, heavy salting, basic smoking, simple drying. The sophisticated system that once flourished here becomes impossible in the urban environment. Language itself shifts against preservation of knowledge. The old, Norse tongue, perfect for encoding preservation techniques in memorable verse, evolves into regional dialects, Norwegian, Swedish, Danish, Icelandic, diverging from each other, and from their common root. Technical terms lose precision across this linguistic drift. A word for a specific stage of fermentation in Old Norse might have no exact equivalent in emerging Norwegian dialects. The specialized vocabulary Astrid taught names for different types of cold storage, terms for various fermentation stages, specific words for herb properties, and uses these fade from common speech. Some survive only in remote dialects, their original meanings obscured. Others disappear entirely, the concepts they represented forgotten along with the words. Economic forces prove inexorable. The medieval warm period, roughly 950 to 1250 after Christ, brings milder winters to Scandinavia. Average temperatures rise by perhaps 1 or 2 degrees, enough to shorten winters significantly and reduce their severity. The desperate need for optimal food preservation lessens. Families survive winters with less sophisticated methods. This warming paradoxically undermines Astrid's legacy. Her techniques were developed for brutal winters like the one that killed her mother. When winters become milder, the selective pressure driving innovation weakens. Adequate preservation replaces excellent because adequate suffices for survival. Why maintain complex systems when simpler methods work well enough? Trade networks expand dramatically through the 11th century. The Hanseatic League begins forming, connecting Scandinavian ports to a vast European trading system. Imported foods, grain from Germany, salt from France, preserved foods from distant lands flow north in unprecedented quantities. Self-sufficiency matters less when ships arrive regularly with goods to buy. Why master complex preservation when you can purchase whatever you need? The knowledge becomes optional rather than essential for survival. Families who once would have desperately studied preservation methods can now rely on markets and merchants. The hard-won understanding that Astrid fought to preserve seems increasingly irrelevant to people who can simply buy stored food. Political consolidation continues under powerful Christian monarchs. The Scandinavian kingdoms centralize further under kings who prefer standardized practices they can control and tax. Royal officials promote uniform methods across their realms, issuing guidelines for food preservation that prioritize simplicity and consistency over excellence. Regional variations, like Astrid's techniques preserved in Hordaland or Iceland, become inconvenient exceptions to eliminate. Standardization serves administrative efficiency. Royal inspectors can verify compliance more easily when everyone uses the same methods. But standardization destroys accumulated wisdom, erasing subtle regional adaptations developed through centuries of experience. The written record fails to capture what matters most. As Latin literacy spreads through Christian Europe, oral tradition loses status. Knowledge not written in Latin seems unreliable, primitive, untrustworthy. But Astrid's techniques were designed for oral transmission, encoded in songs and stories, passed through hands-on teaching that cannot be captured in text. What can writing convey about the touch that tells you fermentation is perfect? How do you describe in words the subtle smell difference between beneficial transformation and dangerous rot? How do you teach through text the intuition developed through years of practice? The old women who carry this wisdom in their bodies, their senses, their lived experience, they die, and nothing written adequately preserves what they knew. By 1050 after Christ, 92 years after Astrid's death, her methods survive only as fragments. A grandmother in Hordaland still ferments fish in the old way, following steps her mother taught her, but she cannot explain why the timing matters or what happens during transformation. Her children learn the steps but not the understanding. An Icelandic family maintains an earth pit cold storage, a structure their great-grandfather built, but they do not understand the principles of air circulation that make it work. They simply follow tradition without comprehension. When the structure needs major repairs, they might rebuild it incorrectly, losing function without realizing it. A Swedish household uses certain herbs in preservation: juniper, dill, wild thyme, because their grandmother insisted these herbs were essential. But they do not know the antibacterial properties of these plants, cannot identify them reliably in the wild, and might substitute similar-looking plants that lack preservative qualities. The pieces scatter like fragments of a broken vessel, disconnected from the systematic understanding that made them powerful. Individuals hold pieces: one knows fermentation, another knows cold storage, a third knows herbs, but no one holds the complete system. And without the complete system, the individual pieces work less effectively, like trying to sail with only part of a ship. The final blow comes from literacy's cruel paradox. As written culture spreads, oral traditions disappear. Young people trust books over grandmothers, written Latin over spoken Norse, but the books contain wrong information. Monastic preservation texts teach methods developed by monks who never studied with Astrid, who never learned the complete system, who solved preservation problems independently and differently. These monastic methods work adequately, but they lack the sophistication of what Astrid taught. Heavy salting, prolonged smoking, thorough drying, these are the techniques recorded in Latin texts and taught in Christian schools. They preserve food reliably, if not deliciously. They require no special architecture, no understanding of fermentation, no knowledge of herbs beyond common salt. They are simpler, more controllable, easier to teach and replicate, and so the monastically approved methods spread while Astrid's techniques fade. People trust what is written in Latin by educated monks over what old women remember from their grandmothers. The written word carries authority that oral tradition lacks in this new Christian age. The books replace the songs, the texts replace the teachers, and something essential is lost in translation. By 1100 after Christ, Astrid's name itself fades from memory. The sagas that once celebrated her as a provider become confused with other Astrids, other Volvas, other wise women. Her specific historical existence blurs into legend, mixed with mythological figures. People speak of ancient preservation techniques without remembering who developed them, treating them as arising spontaneously from trial and error over countless generations, rather than as one woman's systematic innovation. She becomes an old woman who knew the ways. Not Astrid Bergsdottir of Hordaland, who lived from 846 to 958 after Christ. She becomes wise women of ancient times, not a specific person with a mother and father, with siblings and students, with a documented life. The historical woman disappears into myth, and with her disappearance goes the context that made her achievement understandable. Some techniques persist in remote locations. Icelandic Hakal fermented shark continues using methods descended from Astrid's teachings, though no one remembers their origin. Norwegian lutefisk preparation follows protocols that encode her insights about balanced fermentation. Swedish surströmming perpetuates traditions that trace back to her schools, though the connection is completely forgotten. These foods become traditional without anyone remembering that tradition began with innovation. They are the way we have always done things, not the method Astrid taught our great-great-grandmothers. The living history becomes timeless tradition, and in becoming timeless, it loses the human story that made it meaningful. By 1200 after Christ, the forgetting is nearly complete. Astrid's preservation revolution, which transformed Viking culture and enabled Norse expansion across the North Atlantic, has disappeared from conscious memory. Her name survives in fragmentary saga references that scholars cannot reliably connect to historical reality. Her methods survive in scattered regional practices that no one recognizes as pieces of a once complete system. The long forgetting has accomplished what no enemy could achieve, the erasure of a woman who changed her world. Not through violence or destruction, but through cultural transformation, religious change, economic evolution, and the inevitable entropy that claims all knowledge, not constantly renewed through teaching and practice. The fresh hus structures she designed either fall into ruin or get repurposed without understanding their original function. The fermentation vessels she perfected are used for simpler preparations, the texts she wrote are burned or lost. The students she trained die, and their students die, and the knowledge bleeds away generation by generation until nothing remains but shadows and fragments. The winter hunger that killed Astrid's mother in 862 after Christ returns in various forms. Not as severely, perhaps the medieval warm period and expanded trade prevent the worst famines, but waste returns, inefficiency returns, the constant struggle with preservation returns. The solution Astrid provided is forgotten, and her people must struggle once again with problems she had solved. The tragedy is not just that knowledge was lost. The tragedy is that it was lost unnecessarily. Astrid tried to preserve it through schools, through texts, through training hundreds of women. She understood that knowledge requires institutional support, that individual wisdom dies with individuals, unless embedded in lasting structures. But the structures fell, the institutions collapsed, and the knowledge scattered into darkness. The long forgetting stretches across centuries, seeming permanent and complete, but nothing is ever completely lost. Fragments remain, waiting in ruins and texts and regional traditions, waiting for someone to recognize them and piece them back together. The forgetting is long, but it is not forever. Eventually, the recovery will begin. Part 7. Echoes across the centuries. The forgetting is never absolute. Knowledge has its own survival strategies, finding unexpected refuges when obvious paths close. In the remote valleys of Iceland, where harsh conditions demand preservation excellence, families maintain techniques closer to Astrid's original methods than anywhere else in the Norse world. They do not know they preserve her legacy. They simply follow the old ways, practices their great-great-grandmothers taught, methods that work when nothing else does. Hakal preparation exemplifies this unconscious preservation. Greenland shark, caught in deep waters, contains toxic compounds that make its flesh poisonous when fresh, but fermented properly for months, then hung to dry for additional months. It becomes edible, an acquired taste perhaps, but preserved food that lasts through endless winters. The fermentation process, the burial in gravel pits, the careful timing, the spiritual attitudes surrounding preparation, all descend directly from techniques Astrid perfected, though no one remembers her name. Medieval monasteries independently rediscover some of Astrid's principles through their own desperate necessity. Benedictine monks, following their rule of self-sufficiency, experiment with food preservation to maintain isolated communities. They develop fermentation techniques that converge on solutions similar to hers. Sauerkraut emerges in German monasteries, using methods that would look familiar to anyone trained in Bergr. The principle of combining fermentation with cold storage, of using specific herbs for preservation, of careful architectural design for storage spaces, these ideas recur because they work, because they solve universal problems. The monks believe they innovate, creating new knowledge through pious experimentation. They do not know they resurrect forgotten wisdom, that a Norse woman solved these problems centuries earlier with greater sophistication. The centuries between 1200 and 1600 after Christ represent the nadir, the low point when Astrid's legacy seems utterly obliterated. The Black Death, arriving in Scandinavia around 1350 after Christ, kills perhaps one-third of the population. The social disruption destroys whatever fragile transmission of traditional knowledge remained. Families with preserved techniques die out completely. Villages that maintained preservation traditions lose everyone who knew them. The plague might have been less devastating, with better food preservation and nutrition. Healthy, well-fed populations resist disease better than malnourished ones. But the knowledge that might have helped Astrid's systematic approach to maintaining nutrition through winter is mostly lost. The populations struggle and die without access to wisdom that once existed in their own culture. Yet even the Black Death cannot completely erase all traces. In Norway's Hardanger region, remote farms high in the mountains maintain elaborate preservation techniques through the plague years and beyond. These families follow methods that local tradition attributes to the old ones, meaning pre-Christian ancestors. When anthropologists study Hardanger food practices in the 20th century, they find sophisticated fermentation and storage systems that puzzle them too advanced, too systematic to have developed through simple trial and error. The Renaissance brings indirect revival. As European scholars rediscover classical texts and celebrate ancient knowledge, interest grows in traditional practices of all kinds. Alchemists experiment with fermentation, seeing transformation as related to their transmutation goals. They document processes, record observations, create theoretical frameworks. They do not know they echo Norse techniques from 6 centuries past, but their work preserves and systematizes principles Astrid once taught. Botanical studies flourish in the 16th and 17th centuries after Christ. Scholars catalogue plants and their properties, rediscovering the antibacterial qualities of herbs Astrid used. Juniper oil, thyme oil, dozens of plant compounds that prevent spoilage. These receive scientific names and systematic study. The knowledge returns piecemeal, without context, claimed as new discoveries rather than recovered wisdom. The age of exploration forces preservation, innovation through desperate need. As European ships voyage for months or years on circumnavigation attempts and trade expeditions, scurvy and food spoilage kill more sailors than storms or combat. Ship captains and naval surgeons experiment frantically with preservation methods, trying anything that might keep crews alive on extended voyages. Captain James Cook's famous success in preventing scurvy during his Pacific explorations in the 1770s after Christ depends partly on sauerkraut fermented cabbage that maintains vitamin C through long voyages. Cook receives credit for this innovation and scientific validation, but he uses techniques that Astrid perfected 900 years earlier. She taught that fermented vegetables maintain their life-giving properties, though she could not name vitamin C or understand the biochemistry. She was right, and Cook proves it, but history credits him, not her. The 19th century brings romantic fascination with Viking heritage. Scholars and nationalists begin excavating Norse sites, studying sagas, reconstructing Viking culture for political and cultural purposes. They find fragments saga passages mentioning wise women who kept households alive through winters, runic inscriptions referencing food preservation, archaeological remains of sophisticated storage structures. An excavation in Hordaland in 1873 after Christ uncovers the ruins of an elaborate earth pit structure near the remains of a longhouse. The archaeologist, a Norwegian scholar named Gustav Storm, puzzles over the design. It is clearly not a burial chamber, wrong shape, wrong orientation, no human remains. Not a storage cellar in the usual sense, too elaborate, with multiple chambers and evidence of ventilation channels. He publishes a paper suggesting it might be a specialized food storage facility, but lacks context to understand its true sophistication. More excavations throughout the late 1800s reveal similar structures across Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Iceland. A pattern emerges. These sophisticated preservation facilities appear in the archaeological record from approximately 850 to 1000 after Christ, then largely disappear. Something happened during those centuries, some change in food culture, but the written records are too sparse to explain clearly. Saga scholars find references to Astrid in multiple sources. She appears in Icelandic family sagas as a woman who taught preservation arts. Norwegian kings' sagas mention her briefly as an advisor to Harald Fairhair. The German historian Adam of Bremen, writing around 1075 after Christ, mentions a pagan woman whose food preservation schools troubled Christian authorities in the previous century. The sources are fragmentary and sometimes contradictory, but a historical figure begins emerging from myth. In 1915 after Christ, a Norwegian scholar named Ingeborg Møller publishes a groundbreaking paper connecting archaeological evidence with saga references. She argues that Astrid Bergsdottir of Hordaland was a real historical figure who revolutionized Norse food preservation in the late 9th and early 10th centuries after Christ. Other scholars dismiss this as speculative feminist revisionism, but Müller's work plants seeds for future research. The 20th century brings scientific validation. Microbiologists studying fermentation discover that different bacterial strains produce different results, that some cultures are more effective than others, that centuries of selection can create optimized fermentation bacteria. In 1963 after Christ, archaeologists excavating the Bergen waterfront for a construction project uncover an extremely well-preserved site, a structure protected by clay and waterlogged conditions that prevented decay. The structure is elaborate multiple chambers, ventilation channels, evidence of sophisticated temperature control. More importantly, sealed vessels within contain preserved organic matter. The clay vessels held their contents for nearly 1,000 years, creating a time capsule of medieval Norse preservation practices. Scientific analysis of the organic matter reveals fermented fish and vegetables, still identifiable after centuries. More fascinatingly, DNA analysis of bacteria from these vessels shows unique fermentation strains, some unknown in modern samples. These are not random bacteria but carefully selected cultures, deliberately maintained and passed from batch to batch. Someone was practicing sophisticated microbiology 1,000 years before Pasteur supposedly founded the field. Carbon dating places the site between 900 and 950 after Christ. Location records indicate this area of Bergen once held a complex of buildings associated with women's education and food preservation. The pieces suddenly connect this Astrid school, or one of her storage facilities. The scientific evidence validates what sagas hinted at, but historians dismissed as legend. Through the late 20th century, more discoveries accumulate. An archaeologist excavating in Iceland in 1986, after Christ finds texts hidden in a church wall, pages of runic writing detailing preservation techniques, hidden by someone who wanted to preserve forbidden knowledge. The runes describe fermentation as teaching food to sleep through winter, use terminology that appears in saga references to Astrid, and include a note saying the knowledge comes from Astrid Provider, who learned from Berit of the Sami people. The contemporary Nordic food renaissance consciously reclaims this heritage. René Redzepi, opening his restaurant Noma in Copenhagen in 2003 after Christ, makes fermentation central to new Nordic cuisine. He and his team research traditional Scandinavian preservation methods, discovering sophisticated techniques in old farm practices, regional specialties, and archaeological evidence. They unknowingly channel Astrid's principles: complex fermentation, seasonal ingredients, allowing food to transform naturally. Noma popularizes foods like gravlax, traditional fermented fish, aged meats, items that descend directly from Astrid's innovations. Redzepi speaks reverently about ancient wisdom encoded in traditional practices, about learning from grandmother techniques. He does not know he is resurrecting one woman's systematic innovation, but his work brings that innovation roaring back into contemporary consciousness. Traditional foods gain new prestige as cultural heritage. Norwegian rakfisk, Swedish surströmming, Icelandic hakal, Danish pickled herring. These foods were once considered peasant fare or survival necessity. Now they appear in upscale restaurants and cultural tourism marketing. Food historians trace their origins, discovering systematic knowledge that once unified them, realizing these disparate regional foods are fragments of a common tradition. Feminist scholars recognize Astrid's story as emblematic of women's erased contributions to civilization. How many other women mastered essential knowledge that sustained societies but left no names in official histories dominated by kings and warriors? How much wisdom was lost because male-dominated institutions valued military conquest over household management and food security? Astrid becomes a symbol Her rediscovered story, inspiring efforts to recover women's historical contributions across all fields. Museums in Bergen and Reykjavik reconstruct preservation houses based on archaeological evidence and saga descriptions. They demonstrate ancient methods to visitors, showing how ice pits work, how fermentation transforms food, how herbs preserve and flavor simultaneously. School groups learn about preservation as cultural heritage. The knowledge that nearly disappeared completely now receives institutional protection and celebration. Modern food security researchers study traditional preservation for practical application. As climate change threatens global food systems, as supply chains prove vulnerable to disruption, Astrid's principles gain new relevance. Working with natural processes rather than against them, using locally available materials rather than depending on industrial inputs. Designing for resilience rather than optimization, these principles, developed in 9th century Scandinavia, might help address 21st century challenges. Scientists experiment with her techniques adapted for contemporary needs. Can traditional fermentation reduce food waste in developing countries? Can low-energy cold storage based on traditional architecture provide refrigeration where electricity is unreliable? Can herb-based preservation reduce dependence on chemical preservatives? The 900-year-old knowledge might help solve modern problems that industrial approaches have failed to address. Astrid Bergsdottir, dead since 958 after Christ, returns to life in contemporary consciousness. The Norwegian government recognizes her historically in 2015 after Christ, installing a statue in Bergen depicting her holding a fermentation vessel and teaching 2 young women. The inscription reads, "Astrid Provider, who conquered winter through wisdom." Schools teach her story as part of Norwegian history. Children learn that a woman's knowledge enabled Viking expansion, that household management was as important as seafaring and raiding, that wisdom preserved through teaching matters as much as treasures preserved through burial. Her legacy enters the curriculum, ensuring new generations know her name and understand her contributions. Contemporary Nordic women chefs consciously connect to her tradition. They speak of learning from ancestral wisdom, of honoring the grandmothers who kept knowledge alive through dark centuries, of reclaiming traditions that patriarchal history nearly erased. They see themselves as part of a lineage stretching back to Astrid, part of a tradition of women who used food knowledge to sustain families and communities. Cultural historians recognize her story's profound lessons about knowledge, transmission, and preservation. Written texts alone do not preserve practical wisdom. You need living practice, teacher-to-student transmission, institutional support, and cultural value placed on the knowledge. When any of these elements fails, knowledge fragments and fades, even if recorded in books. The story also teaches that knowledge lost can take centuries to recover, and the recovery is never complete. We can reconstruct Astrid's preservation methods from archaeological evidence and saga fragments, but we cannot fully recover the lived experience, the intuition developed through years of practice, the sensory knowledge passed from hand to hand, the spiritual dimension that made preservation sacred rather than merely technical. Most poignantly, the story demonstrates how easily essential knowledge disappears when cultural conditions shift. Christianity's suppression of pagan traditions, political centralization under stronger kings, economic changes from trade expansion, linguistic evolution, changing settlement patterns, each factor alone might not have destroyed Astrid's legacy, but combined they proved overwhelming. Knowledge requires constant defense against the entropy of forgetting. In 2024, after Christ, more than 1,000 years after Astrid's death, her methods inform cutting-edge culinary innovation, while also inspiring preservation efforts in food-insecure regions. Archaeological research continues uncovering more evidence of her work and influence. Genetic analysis of fermentation bacteria traces lineages that might descend from her original cultures. The scientific study of her legacy is still unfolding, but perhaps the most important legacy is not the specific techniques, not the fermentation methods or preservation architecture. Perhaps the most important legacy is the lesson her story teaches. Knowledge, once lost, can take centuries to recover if it can be recovered at all. The invisible work that sustains civilizations, food preparation, household management, cultural transmission deserves recognition and protection equal to warfare and politics that histories traditionally celebrate. Astrid worked to make food twice as delicious and to preserve it through seasons when it would normally rot. But her deeper achievement was creating systems to preserve knowledge itself, schools that trained teachers, texts that recorded methods, networks that connected practitioners. She understood that knowledge preservation matters as much as food preservation, that both require constant attention, that neither happens automatically. The woman who saved countless lives through her preservation innovations nearly disappeared from history entirely. That she returned at all depends on fragments accidentally preserved, dedicated scholars connecting scattered evidence, and contemporary cultures valuing what patriarchal history dismissed. Her story is recovery from near-total loss, resurrection from the grave of forgetting. In the end, Astrid's secret trick was never really secret. She taught it freely, established schools, fought to spread the knowledge widely. The tragedy is that society proved unable to preserve what she worked so hard to share. The food she saved lasted months. The knowledge she created should have lasted forever. That it nearly didn't remains a warning. Wisdom requires tending. Traditions need protecting. The work that sustains civilization must be remembered and honored, or it will be lost again, and the long forgetting will begin anew.